Economic Democracy by Major C.H. Douglas, Chapter 7. If the proceeding endeavour to marshal into some sort of coherent pattern the facts of the general economic and social situation as it exists at present has been to any extent successful, it will be evident that the real antagonism which is at the root of the upheaval with which we are faced is one which appears under different forms in every aspect of human life. It is the age-long struggle between freedom and authority, between external compulsion and internal initiative, in which all the command of resources, information, religious dogma, educational system, political opportunity, and even, apparently, economic necessity is ranged on the side of authority, and ultimate authority is now exercised through finance. This antagonism does, however, appear at the present time to have reached a stage in which a definite victory for one side or the other is inevitable. It seems perfectly certain that either a pyramidal organization having at its apex supreme power and at its base complete subjection will crystallize out of the centralizing process which is evident in the realms of finance and industry, equally with that of politics, or else a more complete decentralization of initiative than this civilization has ever known will be substituted for external authority. The issue transcends in importance all others. The development of the human race will be radically different as it is decided one way or another, but as far as it is possible to judge, the general advantage of the individual will lie with the retention of a measure of coordination in all mechanical organization, combined with the evolution of progressively decentralized initiative, largely by the displacement of the power of centralized finance. The implication of this is a challenge which will become more definite as time goes on, to external authority as to its right to abjudicate on the absolute value expressed in terms of commodities of various forms of activity. Even now, the practical difficulty of estimating the relation between material reward and individual effort is becoming almost insuperable, even in the cases where an honest effort is made to arrive at some solution. The various movements for the grant of a minimum living wage, the demand for the recognition of the right to work, i.e. to draw pay, are all symptoms of the breakdown of the financial law of supply and demand in its application to economic problems. Still another significant feature of the inadequacy of the economic structure is the increase of voluntary unpaid effort and the large amount of energy devoted to games. There is absolutely no concrete difference between work and play unless it be in favour of the former. No one would contend that it is inherently more interesting or pleasurable to endeavour to place a small ball in an inadequate hole with the inappropriate instruments than it is to assist in the construction of a Quebec bridge or the harnessing of Niagara. But for one object, men will travel long distances at their own expense, while for the other they require payment and considerable incentive to remain at work. The whole difference is, of course, psychological. In the one case, there is absolute freedom of choice, not of conditions. But as to whether these conditions are acceptable, there is some voice and control, and there is an avoidance of monotony by the comparatively short period of the game, followed by occupation of an entirely different order. But the efficiency of the performance, as compared with the efficiency of the average factory worker, is simply incomparable. Any factory which could induce for 6 months the united and enthusiastic concentration of, say, an amateur football team would produce quite astonishing results. Now, it may be emphasized here at once that there is absolutely no future for inefficiency as a cult. The whole promise of a brighter, probably a very bright future for the world lies in doing the best possible things in the best possible way. In industrial affairs, the principle of the maximum efficiency of effort per unit of time is so patently unassailable that its enunciation would hardly be necessary, but that the proposition carries with it a very different conception of efficiency than the narrow business meaning commonly attached to the word. And in consequence, it is the fashion amongst the less progressive elements of society to attack any demand for improved conditions as simply an attempt to substitute sloth and incapacity for energy and capability, while therefore a readjustment of system and, above all, a complete reconsideration of objective is necessary. It is probable that the basis of such changes must be economic with political and financial systems, auxiliary rather than definitive, and it is certain that a revision of economic policy to be stable must result in higher economic efficiency, even though the very aim of that higher efficiency is to reduce economic problems to a very subordinate position, and the higher psychological efficiency of voluntary effort is clearly a step to this end. We have just seen that merely increased production under existing conditions will not achieve any economic stability, because there are at least two quite irreconcilable criteria governing the scope of the operations proposed. There is, on the one hand, the adjustment of manufacturing of all sorts to the opportunity of sale, not by any means always profitable sale. And this is a purely artificial and yet all-powerful consideration under present financial systems, and constitutes the effective demand. And there is, on the other hand, the growing real demand first for food, clothing and shelter, and then for participation in the wider life which modern progress has made possible, such demand being quite irrespective of capacity to pay in money. And the reconciliation of these two interests means the defeat of the will to power by the will to freedom, and in this reconciliation is involved a modification of economic distribution. Now, if there is any sanity left in the world at all, it should be obvious that the real demand is the proper objective of production, and that it must be met from the bottom upwards. That is to say, there must be first a production of necessaries sufficient to meet universal requirements, and secondly, an economic system must be devised to ensure their practically automatic and universal distribution. This having been achieved, it may be followed to whatever extent may prove desirable by the manufacture of articles having a more limited range of usefulness. All financial questions are quite beside the point. If finance cannot meet this simple proposition, then finance fails and will be replaced. It has been estimated that 2 hours per week of the time of every fit adult between the age of 18 and 45 would provide for a uniformly high standard of physical welfare under existing conditions, and without endorsing the exact figures, it is perfectly certain that distribution and not manufacture is the real economic problem, and it is at present quite intolerably unsatisfactory. There is no need to assume that the whole machinery of business as we know it must be scrapped. In fact, the machinery of business as machinery is highly efficient, but it must undoubtedly be adjusted so that no selfish desire for domination can make it possible for any interest to hold up distribution on purely artificial grounds. Since the analysis of existing conditions which we have undertaken shows that any centralized administrative organization is certain to be captured by some interest antagonistic to the individual, it seems evident that it is in the direction of decentralization of control that we must look for such alteration in the social structure as would self-protective against capture for interested purposes. As we have already seen, alongside the concentration of political and industrial power, a powerful decentralizing force is already beginning to show itself in various forms. In considering the manifestation of this force, it will be observed that at the moment it is seeking expression through organization in new forms, but for the present operating with old sources of energy, chiefly negative in character, such as strike. To be effective, however, against positive centralization, positive decentralization will have to come. Decentralized economic power is necessary. Among the more important of these forms is the shop steward, or rank and file movement in industry, and the workmen's councils in politics, both purely decentralizing in tendency, quite apart from any special policy for the furtherance of which they may be used. The apprehension with which the movements are regarded by the reactionary capitalist is based far more on a recognition of the difficulties such a scheme of organization offers to successful corruption and capture than to any regard for the specific item in the policy it may for the moment represent, most of which have been previously parried with ease when presented through delegated trade union leaders, whose position of authority have been perforce achieved by exactly the methods best understood by those with whom they have to deal. As the shop steward movement is the most definite industrial recognition from the labour side of the necessity for decentralisation, some examination of the general scheme is of interest. The actual details of the organisation vary from place to place, trade to trade, and even day to day. But the essence of the idea consists in the adoption of a decentralised unit of production, such as the shop or department, and the substitution of actual workers in considerable numbers for the paid trade union official as the nuclei of both industrial and political power, although the political power is not exercised through parliamentary channels. The shop steward is generally industrial rather than craft and interest. That is to say, he represents a body of men who produce an article rather than a section who perform one class of operation for widely different ends. But there is nothing inherently antagonistic as between the two conceptions of function, industrial unionism being largely a militant device. He is quite limited in his sphere of action, but initiates general discussion on the basis of first-hand information and forms a link between the decentralized industrial unit and other units which may be concerned. The practical effect of the arrangement is that the spokesmen are never out of touch with those for whom they speak, since the normal occupation and remuneration of representatives is similar to that of those they represent, and should any cleavage occur, a change of representative can be easily secured. The official concerned has, in theory, no executive authority whatever, nor can he take any action not supported by his co-workers, i.e. the direction of policy is from the bottom upwards instead of the top downwards. The individual shop stewards are banded together in a shop stewards committee, which has again only just as much authority as the individual workers care to delegate to it. It is, of course, obvious that the permanent success of any arrangement of this character depends on a common recognition amongst the individuals affected by the organization of certain principles as confirming standards of reference. In other words, it would be impossible to administer a complicated manufacturing concern on any such principles, unless the general body of employees had a general appreciation of the fundamental necessities of the business, inclusive of direction and technical design. There is no doubt whatever that the idea provides the possibility of self-government without external pressure to an almost unlimited extent, and its similarity in principle to the workmen's councils now appearing as a new feature in the political aspect is obvious and rests on an appreciation of this point of view. It is most difficult in these matters to separate the results of reactionary opposition and attack, to which all experiments dangerous to vested interests are subject, from results due to the actual conditions produced by them. And since it is quite unquestionable that every resource of autocracy, finance, bureaucracy, and trust capitalism is concentrated in implacable opposition to the fundamental principles of decentralization, where applied to initiative and opinion, the exact practical effect of particular efforts to embody such a theory is hidden for the moment by the fog of war. Where, of course, it is clear that there is a confusion of function is that the shop steward claims control not only of the conditions of production, but eventually of the terms of distribution. This confusion is quite inevitable at present, but is not necessarily permanent, and is obviously undesirable. It is based on the fallacy that labour, as such, produces all wealth, whereas the simple fact is that production is 95% a matter of tools and process, which tools and process form the cultural inheritance of the community, not as workers, but as a community, and as such, the community is most clearly the proper, though far from being the legal, administrator of it.